The movie kicks off in sunny California, where a group of horsemen gallop down a mountain toward a quiet mining settlement. The miners are busy sifting through dirt, searching for gold, and handling their daily chores. Suddenly, the peace is shattered by the sound of barking dogs, followed by gunfire as the riders launch a brutal attack. Chaos erupts, homes are destroyed, and the miners, caught off guard, offer little resistance. In the midst of the mayhem, a young girl named Megan Wheeler watches in terror as her beloved dog, Linz, is mercilessly shot by the raiders. Once the attackers finally retreat, the remaining miners take in the devastation, their camp left in ruins. Megan, overwhelmed with grief, is comforted by her mother. As sorrow and anger settle over the camp, Megan buries her dog, reciting the 23rd Psalm as a way to express her pain, fear, and longing for some kind of divine protection. Soft, soothing music plays in the background as the camera pans over the surrounding landscape. Just as her prayer comes to an end, a mysterious rider appears on the horizon, hinting at new developments ahead. Meanwhile, Hull Barrett, one of the miners, chooses to head into town despite being warned about the dangers. His determination, or perhaps stubbornness, drives him forward.
Not quitting, Eddie. Just going into town.
Arriving at the Blankenship mining supply store, he hopes to stock up on necessities. However, Mr. Jeb Blankenship, the store owner, isn't too pleased to see him, reminding Hull of his outstanding debt from 8 months prior.
Speed.
Well, Hull.
From now on, he insists Hull must pay with gold. But Hull argues that with their camp in ruins, they have no choice but to continue mining. Eventually, he convinces Blankenship to extend him credit, not out of friendship, but because Hull is one of the few who hasn't fallen under Lahood's influence.
You got sand, boy, but you ain't got the sense God.
Hull promises to repay his debt with interest once they strike gold. As Hull leaves the store, a group of local troublemakers confront him. They accuse him of being rude and disregarding their warnings. Their taunts soon escalate, and they begin stealing his supplies.
Your head must have jarred your memory.
Kick him again.
Just as they're about to attack him, a mysterious stranger on a white horse appears. He calmly extinguishes a lit match intended to burn Hull's belongings, then swiftly takes down the aggressors with ease. Hull expresses his gratitude, but the stranger rides off without a word. The injured men glare as Hull and his unknown savior head toward Carbon Canyon, while the Blankenships watch with concern. On the journey back, Hull invites the stranger to stay at their camp, assuring him he would be welcome. The stranger agrees. Along the way, they run into Ulrich, another miner who has grown weary of the constant struggles.
No more. I'm not the only one.
He announces that he's leaving for good and advises Hull to do the same if he values his safety. But Hull refuses to give up, and he and the stranger continue on. That evening, as Megan's mother prepares dinner, Megan read aloud from the book of Revelation,
Lahood's rough names.
At least he wasn't afraid of him.
her voice describing ominous figures, a black horse representing famine and a pale horse named death. As she reads, she and her mother glance outside and see Hull approaching with the stranger.
His name that sat on him was Death.
Later, in his cabin, the stranger washes up, revealing scars that hint at a difficult past. Meanwhile, Hull tells Sarah, Megan's mother, about the stranger's encounter with McGill and his gang.
Got us all scared. Lynn?
Sarah isn't thrilled about it. She worries that this man is just as violent as Lahood's men. But Hull argues that the stranger's courage is exactly what they need to resist Lahood's tyranny.
Today.
Nah, right after supper.
No, not.
He points out that many miners, including Lindquist, have already given up and left. Sarah, however, believes their community is already broken. She chastises Hull for filling Megan's head with rebellious ideas and insists that he send the stranger away before his presence invites more trouble.
See there, ma'am? Don't want it to get cool.
If Hull refuses, she threatens to leave with Megan. As their argument unfolds, the stranger walks in, revealing a preacher's collar. The tension in the room shifts. Sarah, taken aback, thanks him for helping Hull, while Megan shoots him a curious smile.
Hull? Well, of course.
Meanwhile, over at Lahood's large mining operation, workers use powerful water hoses to erode hillsides in their relentless search for gold. The bruised and battered men from earlier finally return, explaining to their boss, Josh, that they had to seek medical attention after their encounter. Surprisingly, they admit that it wasn't Hull who beat them, it was a stranger. Intrigued, Josh sends them back to work and calls for Club, a massive enforcer standing over 7 feet tall, suggesting a more forceful approach may be needed. Back at the mining camp, Hull discusses their ongoing conflict with Lahood with the preacher. He explains how Lahood has dominated the local mines since the 1850s using hydraulic mining and is now trying to seize Carbon Canyon. Even though the miners legally own their claims, Lahood's power makes any legal action seem futile. Despite the hardships, Megan refuses to leave, unwilling to let fear dictate her future. Hull admits that the law is useless against Lahood since he controls the local authorities, and there's no solid proof of his wrongdoing. As Hull takes care of Sarah and Megan, his feelings for Sarah become more apparent. Discreetly, he asks the preacher whether he would be willing to officiate a marriage between him and Sarah in the future. Understanding the delicate situation, the preacher agrees to offer whatever help he can to the community, not just spiritually, but in a broader sense. Hull has been working on a large rock in the creek, convinced that there might be gold hidden inside. However, he avoids using explosives to preserve the water source. The preacher joins him, picking up a sledgehammer and striking the rock, drawing the attention of Sarah and the other miners. As they work, Josh and Club arrive from Lahood's camp. Hull introduces them to the preacher, and Josh questions him about his involvement. The preacher simply states that he's here to guide sinners. Club, eager to show his strength, smashes the rock with a single powerful blow. Then, in an attempt to intimidate the preacher, he moves to attack, but the preacher effortlessly deflects him and even helps him back onto his horse. After they leave, the preacher and the miners resume their work. Meanwhile, Lahood himself arrives by train from Sacramento, meeting with his son Josh and Miguel. They update him on recent events, particularly the preacher's presence at the mining camp. Lahood is immediately concerned that this preacher might inspire the miners to resist. Though the idea of capturing him crosses his mind, he decides against it, realizing that such an act could turn him into a martyr. Instead, he focuses on the increasing opposition to hydraulic mining in Sacramento and stresses the importance of taking control of Carbon Canyon while dealing with the preacher in a more calculated manner. Elsewhere, Megan reflects on her family history, recalling that her grandparents had opposed her mother's marriage, not because of her age, but because of the man she chose. Megan wonders if her mother would approve of Hull, but Sarah avoids giving a direct answer, simply acknowledging that Hull is a good man. Megan then asks if preachers are allowed to marry, and Sarah confirms it, also complimenting Megan's beauty. Meanwhile, while working near the creek, Paul discovers a massive gold nugget under a boulder, causing excitement among the miners, except for Spider, who doesn't take it well. The discovery leads to a celebration, and despite Sarah's hesitation, they decide to head into town to help Hull settle his debts. In town, while Hull talks to Mr. Blankenship, Josh approaches the wagon and informs them that his father wants to meet the preacher. Sarah doesn't trust Josh, but the preacher agrees to go. When Lahood meets the preacher, he is taken aback by how strong and confident the man appears. Lahood tries to persuade him to leave Carbon Canyon, offering a new church and preaching opportunities, but the preacher refuses, saying he cannot serve both God and wealth. Frustrated, Lahood threatens legal action to take control of the mining land and gives the preacher 24 hours to convince the miners to leave, hinting at possible violence with Marshal Stockburn's involvement if they refuse. The preacher negotiates with Lahood, who initially offers $100 per mining claim. Using his quick thinking, the preacher gets him to raise it to $1,000 per claim to avoid immediate conflict. However, Lahood still demands that the miners vacate within 24 hours. Meanwhile, Hull finishes settling his debts and returns to the wagon just as the preacher exits Lahood's office, mentioning that they had discussed things over drinks. That night, around a campfire, the miners debate Lahood's offer. Spider is skeptical, suspecting the land might be worth even more. The preacher advises them to consider their decision carefully, warning them about possible violence if they refuse. Hull steps in with an inspiring speech, reminding everyone of their struggles and connection to the land. He questions whether their efforts would mean anything if they just walked away now. Motivated by his words, the miners decide to reject Lahood's money and stand their ground. Later, Megan takes the preacher to her dog's grave, saying his arrival felt like an answer to her prayers. She brings up love and marriage, but the preacher gently tells her that love is a natural part of life and that she will find the right person someday. He hints at Sarah's worries, but Megan misinterprets his words as an expression of affection for her mother. Upset, she runs off. Meanwhile, the preacher heads to Lahood's mining camp to check things out before telling Josh that the miners have refused the deal. Shortly after, a telegraph operator spots the preacher at the station just before he disappears. McGill, an associate of Lahood, sends an urgent telegram to summon the marshal. The message reaches Yuba City, setting things in motion. Back at the mining camp, Paul realizes that the preacher has left, taking his belongings with him. Hull remains optimistic about their chances, but Sarah starts to regret rejecting Lahood's offer, feeling uneasy about relying too much on the preacher. Their conversation is interrupted by a loud explosion. They rush outside to find that Lahood has blocked the creek, cutting off their water supply. Sarah points out that accepting Lahood's deal could have prevented this disaster, increasing the tension within the camp. Meanwhile, the preacher heads to a Wells Fargo office, retrieving his guns from a safety deposit box. He leaves behind his preacher's collar, revealing a past tied to violence. Back at the mining camp, without the preacher's leadership, the miners feel lost and start considering abandoning their claims. Hull tries to lift their spirits by delivering a fake message from the preacher, but it doesn't do much to change their mood. They decide to give mining one last shot for 2 more days. Spider, who never trusted Hull's message, advises him to take Sarah and Megan somewhere safe. Meanwhile, danger is on the way. The marshal and his deputies are approaching. Megan, feeling lonely and eager to help, asks Hull if she can use the mule, and he agrees. Meanwhile, Spider strikes gold again, this time finding a massive nugget, reigniting hope among the miners. Despite the celebration, Hull is feeling down and apologizes to Sarah for the hardships they are facing. He suggests that Spider's new fortune might allow them to leave together and start over. Hull reassures Sarah and Megan of his love and suggests building a new future. Sarah, touched by his sincerity, agrees to stay with him, explaining that her past hesitation was due to her uncertainty. They talk about finding another preacher to marry them, dreaming of a fresh start. Meanwhile, Megan sneaks into Lahood's camp in search of the preacher, but is caught by Josh, who grabs her roughly. The situation escalates until the preacher, watching from the shadows, steps in and rescues her, overpowering Josh and his men before safely escorting Megan away. Back in town, a drunken Spider boldly confronts Lahood, demanding a fight. Inside, Lahood orders Marshal Stockburn and his 6 deputies to eliminate the preacher and the miners, noting that the preacher has an intimidating stare. Outside, Stockburn and his men humiliate Spider, forcing him to dance by shooting at his feet before ultimately killing him when he resists. Lahood watches the execution from a distance, and Stockburn instructs Spider's sons to warn the preacher about an impending showdown. Back in Carbon Canyon, the miners are surprised when the preacher returns with Megan. Ev Gosage fills him in on everything that happened, including Megan's risky visit to Lahood's camp. Sarah and Megan are relieved to see the preacher, but the mood darkens when the community tells him about Spider's murder. Marshal Stockburn and his deputies are now openly challenging the preacher. In a private moment, Sarah expresses her fears to the preacher, reflecting on past losses and choosing to move forward with Hull, who offers her stability. They share a heartfelt conversation before the preacher prepares for the inevitable showdown, keeping his past a mystery. The preacher and Hull devise a plan to disrupt Lahood's mining operations. Before heading to town, the preacher asks Hull to ensure Sarah and Megan's safety. Sarah and Megan discuss how much they admire the preacher, with Megan feeling sad she didn't get to say goodbye. In town, the preacher walks into a saloon and faces off against Lahood, Stockburn, and the deputies. They assume they have killed him in a hail of bullets, but the preacher survives and fights back using strategy and precision. One by one, he takes out Stockburn's men in an intense battle, leading to a final showdown where he kills Stockburn himself. Meanwhile, Hull deals with Lahood, eliminating the last threat. With peace restored, the preacher quietly leaves town. Megan, wanting to follow him, is told not to push the horses too hard. Instead, she calls out her thanks and love to him, her voice echoing through the air. The preacher disappears into the snowy mountains, leaving behind a lasting impact.